Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, the Biden administration's vaccine and testing mandates, but guess what? It's time to redraw the congressional districts and the state legislative districts, and we'll get to those subjects after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, joining me today is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Bryan Cutler. He represents the 100th Legislative District. Mr. Speaker, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
I'll tell you what, the legislature has a number of priorities, and certainly one of them is when it comes to congressional boundary lines, you have to redraw them in the form of a law, which then goes to the governor. I'm going to let you explain the differences and how important are they. And so, I mean, it's always difficult to do the redistricting, correct?
It is. It is something that thankfully we only have to do once every 10 years. It's based off of the census. And as we get the new numbers, and then more importantly, the reapportionment data in terms of how the congressional seats will be distributed amongst the states. In this case, we lose another seat, which is unfortunately a trend that we've been undergoing for some time. So we will take that information, we'll put it into a bill. It'll have to pass the House and the Senate, and then ultimately be signed by the governor into law. That's the process for the congressional districts. The process for the state Senate and state House districts, however, is somewhat different. In that particular case, we have a commission where the four leaders plus a fifth member of the judiciary sits in, and they will draw the new seats based off of the new population numbers for 203 House members and 50 state senators.
Yeah, back in 2018, there was no agreement, and it ended up with the Supreme Court redrawing the boundary lines. And we're losing a seat, as you accurately point out, and yet we have at least one retirement, and we could have more, which probably makes it a little easier since there's no incumbent, and protecting the seat is in a sense very different, correct?
It is. And then the other issue that you have to look at, Dr. Madonna, is where does the population shift from? Yeah. We unfortunately stayed somewhat stagnant, but as a percentage of the United States, we did lose some ground. We're still, I think, the fifth most populous state in the country. However, we moved from sixth to fifth, not because we grew, but because we didn't lose as many citizens as Illinois. So the retirement certainly would make it easier. If that happens to also be co-located where the population drops occurred, that certainly would probably make that task a little bit easier.
And before we move on to another topic, when you're talking about the legislative districts, the five-person commission makes a decision and it's final. Now, obviously, there can be a court challenge to it, but it doesn't have to go to the legislature for approval, as does the congressional boundary line. So that's a pretty significant difference, it seems to me.
It is. And you might recall the last time that we went through this in 2010 to 12, those maps were processed, and then the court remanded it back to the commission to be redrawn. And we actually ended up for the first term in the next 10-year period, we actually ended up running in the same districts. So that has happened, unfortunately, before, but certainly the goal is to take the data that we now have. Unfortunately, we did get the data a little late from the federal government. We were supposed to have it back in the first quarter of this year, and we didn't get it until approximately August. So that certainly put us several months behind in terms of the timeline, but I know the commission will work diligently to find a resolution and get the lines drawn.
All right, thanks. Let's move on to another subject. And you have been asking for COVID data having to do with a whole variety of things from the administration. What is it that you would like to have, and why do you want it?
Well, I think it's the natural starting point is you have to have good data in order to make good decisions. You can go back to any of my floor speeches back when I was majority leader last session, and we consistently said that we needed good information in order to make good decisions. And unfortunately, data regarding COVID and regarding the infection rates, as well as the vaccination rates, and the issues with COVID recovered patients, that's individuals that have fully recovered from an infection, and then the reinfections of both of those subgroups, those who are vaccinated, unvaccinated, as well as the previously recovered. That's all good information to have. Unfortunately, there are some big holes in the data that's being given by the administration right now. For example, they don't provide any data that on the Philadelphia county slash legislative districts, and yet the governor put out data by legislative district, which quite frankly is nothing but politics. Legislative districts by their very nature are political. What would actually be helpful, and I've asked the governor for this, is to actually break out the vaccination rates and the infection rates by school district, because that is the one area right now that is currently under a mandate in terms of mitigation measures by the Secretary of Health. So I think that having those numbers, we could actually get a better assessment of, are the mitigation efforts working, or are they not working, and if not, what needs to change. We can make better policy decisions with access to better data, and certainly look forward to working with the governor to get that.
All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, I know that you're concerned about suspended regulations and where all of that goes, and you can talk about why that's important and why our viewers and Pennsylvanians as a whole should take an interest in the subject, and we'll do that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Well, I'm chatting with Bryan Cutler. He is the Pennsylvania Speaker of the House, obviously in the state legislature. There are a number of suspended regulations, and I think you're talking about extending them. So let's start with the fundamental question. Overall, why were these regulations suspended?
Well, in many cases, the regulations were suspended to make the issues surrounding them easier to process and or work through during the pandemic. The suspension of regulations is a power that was contained in the governor's emergency powers, and he waived a wide variety of them. I'll use an example that I'm familiar with from my background. That's the healthcare world, and we probably all have had interactions with telehealth at this point, where we did a doctor's appointment via FaceTime or Zoom, like we're doing now, or even on the telephone. And that's an area of our law that, quite frankly, desperately needs to be updated, and in terms of billing and coding and charging and how those interactions regarding licensing are all handled. And the fact that we even call it telehealth, I think demonstrates and shows, quite frankly, how outdated that law is. I do all my banking on my phone, but I don't call it telebanking. I simply call it banking. And I think healthcare should be the same way. So in that case, they made some additional regs that made it easier for patients to be seen remotely. In terms of patient safety, I think that was a good improvement in ensuring that they wouldn't unnecessarily venture out and possibly be exposed to COVID. But the truth is, it's also actually more beneficial for the patients because they weren't losing time, and it was more efficient for the physicians. So many of these regulations were waived during the pandemic. We did recently pass a bill, and it became law, where we extended those regulations yet again, and they're pushed through the end of the year at this point. And I think we should take a serious look at those regulations going forward, because if we didn't need them for the last 18 months during the middle of the worst pandemic in nearly a century, then I'm not sure we need them at all. And we really should focus on the patients and us as constituents and consumers, and make sure that government actually does work easier. All
right, before I let you go, it's also bipartisan. So it seems to me we're talking about executive authority in quotes, legislative authority in quotes, and as you know, the differences exist when it comes to certain kinds of issues.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head there, Dr. Madonna, and that's really the issue. It's under the emergency powers prior to the passage of the constitutional amendment, the governor had the ability to suspend them indefinitely. Now, after 21 days, it requires legislative action, which is why we moved the bill.
All right, well, look, I want to thank you for coming on, and I know you have a busy day, and we'll get you back soon. All right, coming up, Gene Barr, the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, joins me for a whole variety of topics after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
As I indicated before, Gene Barr, who is the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, joins me. We have a variety of topics we're going to talk about. Well, let's start with vaccine and testing mandates that the Biden administration has put forward. By the way, they're also in Pennsylvania when it comes to masks and all of that. It gets very complicated, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And unfortunately, so much of what we're talking about in terms of controlling this virus has become politicized, whether it's masks or testing or vaccines. And with the Biden administration's proposal, mandate, as you term it, which is right, coming through OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to require employers of 100 and up to require either testing or vaccines is problematic for a couple of. One, there's a real question whether they have the legal ability to do that. Laying that aside, there's some other questions. We've got incredible staffing shortages that are showing themselves in constraints in our supply chain. What if a whole bunch of people say, I'm quitting and I'm not getting vaccinated?
Well, they are, as far as I know. I mean,
it's happened.
There are police officers who are quitting people.
There are people in the healthcare industry who have quit.
Yeah.
And so this is really problematic. Second, who pays for the test? Who pays for the time to get the test? Who pays for all the attendant costs around that? And so these are real questions. In addition to the legality of and their ability to do it, you have these real questions about how this is going to work in real time. And we're concerned about it. And look, we've had this conversation before. We've been acknowledging vaccines are absolutely critical for us to get out of this. We as an organization haven't mandated it. We've got 50 employees. We're trying to encourage people to do it. But this takes it to a different level, and so we're watching this very carefully.
Yeah. There's also, I think, and when it comes to masks, as you know, Governor Wolf has said you're in the public schools, for example, you have to wear masks. And I get a difference in philosophy. The Republicans generally think that ought to be left to the school boards. Democrats think it ought to be left to the states. So you get that philosophy where Republicans generally support local government and local school districts to make those kinds of decisions.
Yes, and keep in mind the governor at the outset supported that what you call the Republican position, and then went back in reverse. So look, I'm not a medical expert, neither one of us is, but who knows what the impact of this is? Does it help? But what I think will help is rolling out this vaccine to 5 to 11-year-olds once we are as sure as we can be about the safety of that. That is going to help tremendously to help us get out of this. Because you can be carrying it, as you know, be asymptomatic, take it home. We're now finding kids are getting it. Fortunately, when they get it, it tends not to be as significant as it is for older Americans. But that's going to help a lot. Again, it comes back to vaccines as opposed to anything else.
Well, I'll tell you, taxes always come to mind, and there's a federal tax hike proposal. Why don't you talk about what is the tax hike proposal and what's the Chamber's position on it?
Great. It's a federal issue, but we do have a position on it. So you've got two proposals at the federal level that are kind of working their way simultaneously. One, first on a policy level, and two, as you know, they've become incredibly, what a shock, politicized in Washington and tied and linked together, as everything is. The first is the infrastructure bill, which we support.
That was bipartisan, by the way.
That was bipartisan done, exactly right.
Yeah.
And so that's waiting House action. And so what that will do is help with our roads, bridges, highways, mass transit, but also things like our telecommunications.
Sure.
Those shortfalls have been laid bare during this pandemic.
And that would pass in a heartbeat if the Democrats hadn't said we're doing the Build Back Better. I think that's
exactly, which is what's
plan.
called the reconciliation bill, which gets confusing. They call it Build Back Better. But so far, a lot of the far left have said, we're not voting for infrastructure until you vote for that first.
Right.
Here's the problem. $3.5 trillion in borrowing. When you add up what we have borrowed over the last 18 months, it's absolutely incredible. It's taken our debt to new heights, unfortunately. So I guess the one question I have for people is, at what point do we become concerned about debt? I'm certainly there already.
Yeah.
It's what we're passing on to our kids, our grandkids, and our great-grandkids at this point.
Well, it doesn't look like it's going to be $3.5 trillion.
Exactly.
The president met with some Democrats in the White House,
yes,
including Joe Manchin, a moderate Democrat. And he has said we can do
1.9, something like that, something
like
under 2.
1.7 to 1.9.
Something under 2.
So it doesn't look like they're going to get anywhere near 3.5 trillion.
Exactly. Now the question, though, for the what they call progressives or the far left, whichever will they vote for the infrastructure bill, or they continue to block that because they're not getting 3.5? And it's going to be financed by taxes, and it's called taxes on the wealthy. It comes down to all of us in the end.
Okay, we're going to run to a break. I want to finish that up and then get to the pipeline and energy, and we'll do that after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
All right, Gene Barr. So let's draw some conclusionary comments when we're talking about the infrastructure would pass in a heartbeat. Yes or no?
I believe it would once we get rid of the recalcitrant people who want the extra 3.5. Yeah.
Yeah, but the 3.5 isn't going to pass.
I don't believe it will.
And Joe Biden has said, as we
Start looking
indicated
lower.
before, look lower, and he'll sign because he wants a victory.
He
correct?
needs a victory. He's got to get the infrastructure bill or this. I mean, our concern is, and he actually made the statement that it's free, 3.5, because it's not free.
Yeah.
You're putting taxes on people, and what happens is even those at middle income levels pay for this through higher prices and through reduced wages because of lower profits out of the business side. So everyone
we have
pays
a
for
serious supply problem, and with
Tremendous.
inflation. So I think the economy is I won't say teetering on recession, but we've got to be very careful.
Extremely careful. These inflation pressures are incredible. The supply chain issues are tremendous. And we have to be really, really cautious about, I hate to use the term, all the free money that's floating around out there from over the last 12 to 18 months.
All right. Right now, as you know, the state produces through natural gas a huge part of the economy, particularly for the southwestern part of our state. And the big debate, now obviously some environmentalists want it stopped completely, but the big debate has turned to pipeline development and possible environmental problems with the pipelines.
Well, look, we're the #2 natural gas producer in the United States.
Right.
It is a tremendous economic boon for this Commonwealth and this country, our energy independence, but also has the potential to play geopolitically. So some people who don't want fossil fuels, and I'm not, look, some people are truly concerned, I get that. But what we've seen is people blocking these pipelines. Penny's pipeline, which would carry natural gas out of the northeast part of the state, and we have some of the most prolific wells anywhere, into places like New York and New Jersey. Those states that unfortunately would be part of RGGI if that goes through are blocking that economic development. And so you have the situation where you have a president who is begging the Saudis and the Russians to produce more because ours is down and no one wants to invest because they're worried about getting their money out.
But I'll tell you, in our state, you've got a progressive governor, Tom Wolf, who fully supports natural gas production. Now, he's also expressed some concern about the pipeline.
Yes.
And I've repeated this ad nauseum, as they say. Joe Biden, August of 2020, you know what he does? He goes out to Allegheny County and he says, I'm for fracking.
Exactly. And the governor recognizes what this has done for Pennsylvania, to his credit. He wants to put more taxes on them. We're willing to have implemented. But here's the problem. As President Biden says, he has said that, but he shut down the Keystone XL pipeline. He's helped and worked to keep the Line 5 that provides crude into northwest Pennsylvania.
Right.
He's asked the Saudis and the Russians to produce more, which his view is, we want to reduce fossil fuel. The problem is you're actually increasing poor environmental performance because the Saudis and the Russians do not operate their energy exploration in as environmentally beneficial manner as those in this country do. And you're hurting the prospects for Western Europe because they're now reliant on Vladimir Putin and not reliant on us.
All right. I want to go to the status of the economy. We talked about it before. Where do you think all this heads?
Well, you hit on it. I mean, we've got tremendous pressures. Part of the good news is wages are up significantly. Yeah. They've had to move them up in order to attract people. That creates inflationary pressures, however, and a lot of times those wages are going to be offset by the inflation that we're seeing, the supply chain issues, and you hit it. I'm concerned about what we see. We need to get people back to work. We need to get this pandemic behind us. We need not to continue to borrow exorbitant sums of money, and we need to let this economy work, and we need to begin, and we need to recognize we need energy independence.
And the potential for inflation is very big, correct?
Very big. I'm worried, you and I both remember this, I'm worried about a return to the misery index from the 1980s.
Yeah, well, remember we had Jimmy Carter and something called stagflation.
Exactly.
Double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment, but the employment situation looks much better.
And mortgages at 18-19%.
We can forget. Look, you made a great point the last time you were on when we were talking about this, and you said the fact that so many people are working at home, let's talk about Zoom and Skype, and guess what? That means they're not in cities and in suburbs working in their offices, and they're not spending money that they would for lunches and dinners and going out and doing a whole variety of things.
These restaurants and gift shops and dry cleaners, many have not come back. Some have started to come back. I've noticed in downtown Harrisburg where I work, some have, but it's not at the level where it was, nowhere near. And I'm concerned that it might not ever get there because even in our operation, we've got people who are going to be working remotely for some period of time. Some of it due to child care concerns, some of it because of a personal preference, and you want to keep your people and keep them happy. And we found that we can work remotely, but I do believe, from our perspective, we work better in person. But you have to find and strike that balance. But it does have an economic impact. What our cities and towns look like when this is over, I think is still a best guess of anybody.
Yeah, well, I think you make a good point. Now, people fortunately starting to go back to work. Well, look, I want to thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Our pleasure. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, you stay well.